How much is higher education worth? The answer is different depending on which country you're in. In the United States, college can come with a hefty price tag, while in Europe, many students receive a free education. So what are the true costs of a college education? I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Germany is the latest European country to offer free higher education to its students after the last German state charging tuition changed its policies. And it's not just free for Germans. International students are welcome to enroll in German universities for the same price. Germany joins a growing list of European countries providing free higher education, including Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Greece, among others. Some also provide a stipend for living expenses. Proponents of these policies say higher education is a universal right for all, while opponents argue there's no such thing as a truly free education. In the meantime, Germany's colleges may start filling up with students from all over the world seeking to avoid debt while getting a degree. Joining us to discuss Germany's free education policies and higher education across Europe, from Oxford, England, is Howard Hodson, a professor of history at the University of Oxford. From Ohio, Richard Vedder is director of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity, and Mark Hilsman, a senior policy analyst with Demos, is with me right here in the studio. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Dr. Hodson, let me start with you. There are a number of countries which are now offering free higher education. We have Finland, Norway, Greece, and now Germany. Is it an economically sustainable model?
Well, I think the first thing to say actually is that there are several more countries than that which offer free higher education. Sweden, Ireland, Denmark, and indeed here in the UK, Scotland as well. This was the standard model in Europe for funding higher education in the post-war period. So it's not an innovation. What's an innovation is the retreat from that, gradually in some countries and radically in others. And the interesting thing is that the German politicians in most of the individual German federal states proposed to adopt tuition fees about 8 years ago, and now they're all being rolled back because it was basically rejected in the polls. Question about whether it's sustainable, is an open one. But a lot of those countries, and including the countries which have very, very low tuition fees in Europe, the Swiss, for instance, the Austrians, the French, the Belgians, charge less than $1,000 a year. And some of those are amongst the finest university systems in the world and offering some of the best value for money in Switzerland, for instance. So I would certainly bet on the Swiss, for instance, to maintain a superb quality higher education system without charging enormous tuition fees.
Dr. Vedder, the United States has one of the most expensive higher education systems in the world. How did we get to this point?
Well, it's taken a long time. Tuition fees in the United States have risen at about twice the level of inflation for the last 30 years. And there's a number of theories as to why that is so, including a reduction in government support. But also we have a number of private universities that receive relatively little government support that have also increased their fees a great deal. The federal financing system to students or providing loans is often considered to be one of the culprits, if you want to use that term, in the rising fees. And I think I subscribe to the view that that's probably the case.
Mark Hilsman, if we look at the class of 2014, according to the Wall Street Journal, each student is going to leave college or leave university with debt of $33,000. That's each one. Do you think, under those circumstances, that more students might be looking in the future to, say, university in Europe?
Well, I think that, to Dr. Hodson's point, it's not a radical shift to say that a lot of countries think of higher education as a public good, right? They think of it as something that students should be able to access for relatively cheap, if not free, and that's how we think about our K-12 education system in this country. And as the growing need for post-secondary skills around the world has increased, most countries have increased attainment. We've kind of done the opposite in the US, and we've reduced per-student investment, particularly at public schools. So we're getting to a point where college is more necessary than ever for a lot of students, and costs have increased, particularly because public support has dwindled.
Dr. Hodson, when we look at the free tuition offered by those countries that you mentioned earlier on, is it a good education? Are students getting a good education?
Well, it's difficult to generalize, of course, but you know, again, if you go back to the Swiss system, I think they get a wonderful education, and the closer you look, the clearer it is that they also get superb value for money. And the reason, I think, is that the Swiss system is effectively organized on a cantonal basis. You have all these small local communities who want to ensure that their own communities have access to first-rate higher education. So they have the two best federal universities in continental Europe. They're sort of Swiss alternatives to MIT and Caltech. And then they have other highly international, highly competitive universities queuing up behind them. So it's not that one funding model is necessarily a guarantee for success, but I think there's plenty of evidence that it's possible to sustain first-rate higher education on a very cost-effective basis, effectively on the basis of public subsidy rather than huge private tuition fees.
Dr. Vedder, as we heard earlier on, the United States offers some of the best higher education in the world. It does cost you, and there is a different attitude in the United States that if you want something of quality, and that could be any product, you have to pay for it. So is this a case of getting what you pay for?
Well, I think a lot of people think that's the case. The admissions, demand for admissions to the very expensive elite private universities in the United States is actually quite high right now. If you want to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, it's very difficult to get in. The inexpensive state universities, some of them are having trouble even maintaining enrollment at all. And indeed, total enrollments in the United States are down for the last 3 years. They're lower today than they were 3 years ago, partly because these high fees have deterred some people from going to college. So yes, in a way, I think you get what you pay for. But I would add that because of student financial assistance, that is tuition reductions to low-income students, for example, a lot of relatively modest income people in the United States are able to get very, very good educations at the most elite schools, such as Harvard University.
Dr. Hodson, what do you make of that argument that you get what you pay for? If you pay, you'll get a better education?
Well, I mean, I think I would actually agree with a fair bit of what Dr. Vedder has written, that there is a higher education cost crisis in the United States. I think where we would disagree, however, is whether marketization is the way to drive up value for money. I mean, the problem is that whereas traditionally elite universities distribute access to their very scarce resources, places to study at Harvard or Princeton, on the basis of academic merit, marketization would actually distribute those same places on the basis of ability to pay. So if you actually fully marketize higher education, you'd see the cost driven up as the wealthiest will pay virtually anything to get their young people into the most elite universities. Well, this would also, of course, drive the quality of incoming students down, because you'd be distributing these places on the basis of wealth rather than on the basis of academic potential. So fundamentally, I think the problem with the U.S. system is that since the 1970s and accelerating in the 1980s and 90s, the marketization of higher education has had precisely the opposite effect from what its original advocates suggested. And what most worries me is that now here in the United Kingdom, the English, not the Scottish, but the English are pursuing exactly the same policy, but in an even more radical fashion.
Dr. Vedder, is there such a thing as a free education? Somebody has to pay for it somewhere along the line.
Yeah, that's my view too. There's no, as we sometimes say in the United States, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And indeed, the cost of higher education in the United States to society as a whole, forgetting for the moment who's paying for it, has grown enormously over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, many people would argue this has been a good investment, and we could have that discussion, but it's an expensive investment at a time when we have an aging population, we have other obligations as a society that are very expensive to meet. The cost per student to going to an American university is substantially higher than it is most places in Europe, with the possible exception of Switzerland. And it's more expensive than, say, for example, than in England to go to the United States. And one would have to ask, well, why is this so? And I think in part the federal system that is designed to help students meet these fees, student loans and so forth and grants, have actually allowed the universities to raise their fees more than they otherwise would, and has added to the problem rather than solving it. In that sense, I agree with my colleague from the University of Oxford.
Dr. Hodson, even in Switzerland, where you may... Sorry, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, I would actually agree with Dr. Vedder that the current system in the United States has helped drive up prices. And it's very, very useful to compare the value for money which the US system produces with that of its European counterparts. The problem is that universities can spend an almost infinite amount of money in support of academic excellence in teaching and research. So unless higher education tuition fees are capped in some way, they will always spend every penny that they get, and they'll request more to meet the wealthiest competitors at home and overseas. The point is then that the only solution to the problem is to maintain a firm lid on higher education tuition fees. This is what was done in this country throughout the 80s and 90s. While US higher education costs per student went through the roof, they were actually reduced by over 40% in the UK because they kept a very firm lid on tuition fees. Now, obviously, on overall expenditure per student. Now, obviously, if you keep that down long enough, you can actually damage the quality of education. But what it does prove is the problem is not federal or state funding. The problem is uncapping tuition fees and encouraging this kind of open-ended competition between universities. Each one wants to be able to outspend the other, and that's what's ratcheted up the tuition fee inflation and the other cost inflation in the United States.
We are going to take a break right now, but coming up, we'll look at free higher education in Europe. But in the US, students are staggering under a heavy load of debt. Our guests break down what some are calling a student loan crisis. That's coming up next on The Heat. Stay with us.